Welcome to Canadian Innovators, the show that celebrates innovation, entrepreneurs, and the Canadian spirit. I'm Jocelyn, and every week we introduce a new entrepreneur or expert in the economy to tell their stories and unpack the challenges of keeping jobs in Canada, as well as discuss potential solutions for job growth and prosperity. The ESG movement has become all the rage with the woke corporations of late. It is not enough that small to medium sized business must deal with rising prices, supply chain challenges, lack of employees. They now must meet the requirements of large corporations demanding nebulous ESG policies. Joining us to discuss this today and back for return engagement is Dr. Jack Mintz. Dr. Mintz is the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He's currently chair of the Alberta Premier's Economic Recovery Council. He also serves on the board of Imperial Oil Limited and Alberta Health Services. He is a distinguished fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, senior fellow at C.D. Howe Institute, and research fellow at International Tax and Investment Center in Washington, D.C. He's been awarded the Order of Canada in 2015, as well as receiving the Queen's Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. He is an economic professor in universities around Canada and the United States. Welcome back to the program, Dr. Mintz.
My pleasure, Jocelyn.
Dr. Mintz, can you tell the viewers who might not know about the ESG movement, what it's about? Can you give us a Reader's Digest lesson, please?
Well, I could actually take up the whole program just talking about what ESG actually means, but doing it as briefly as I can. The E stands for environment, S stands for social, and G stands for governance. And what various rating agencies do is that they have a whole bunch of factors underlying each of these categories, and they try to evaluate companies in terms of their ability to meet the requirements of environmental, social, and governance demands that could impact their sustainability. And the big one, let's be honest, is climate change, which is under the environment category. There's other environmental issues too that are important that one should not forget, but climate change is the big one. And of course, there are three types of climate change data that companies are being asked to provide. One is called Scope 1, which is the actual greenhouse gas emissions that a company emits through its operations. Scope 2 is the emissions associated with the supplies that the company might purchase in terms of energy from other companies, for example. And Scope 3 is right through the whole supply chain. For example, if you're a small oil and gas, let's say, service company, you might have to take into account the whole value added associated with your activities in terms of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with it. And of course, that's both upstream and downstream, and so that's a huge issue of complexity for many companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one that a small company like our company is being faced with, and it just adds huge cost and complexity to running your operations. Thank you for that overview. Many economists, and political commentators have drawn a link between the United Nations sustainability goals, the World Economic Forum, and the ESG movement. We got about a minute left, but could you comment upon this?
Well, yes. I mean, there's actually a whole bunch of promoters now of ESG. It includes asset management companies like BlackRock. It includes financial companies that are lending money. It also includes various governments, et cetera. They all have their fingers in the pie to try to promote ESG. It'll either come through financial markets or will come through regulations imposed by governments.
Yeah, and it is very complex. Elon Musk called ESG a scam, and Warren Buffett called ESG asinine. Can you shed some light on their thoughts? We just have about 30 seconds left.
Well, I think for many investors, they are mainly interested in the rate of return on their investments. And what they're seeing now is that actually ESG has not provided the returns that they thought they were going to get. In fact, there's been some let's say, fall back in terms of the amount of money that's been going into ESG funds. It did grow quite a bit in 2020, in terms of the amount of money that went into ESG funds. But now that's actually been pulled back recently.
So we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're discussing the ESG movement and what it means to Canadians and Canadian industry. Dr. Mintz, before we went to break, you were talking about the returns. Please carry on with your thought.
Well, I think investors obviously are interested in the rate of return that they're going to get on their investment. They want to make money. They don't want to lose money. And what's happened recently is that ESG funds, particularly this past year, have not done very well. And in fact, there's actually been withdrawals, I think, just in the past month from ESG funds. And I think it just goes to the point that both Warren Buffett and Elon Musk is saying is that really in the end, investors want to make money, and it's not ESG that is going to necessarily drive the amount or how well a company will do. They'll invest in a company that has good environmental records if it's making money, but they're not going to invest just simply because it has good environmental practices, but it's losing money. And I think that's the main point.
So let's focus on the impact on the ESG movement on the Canadian resource sector. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think ESG is having both a positive and a negative impact. The positive impact is obviously that we are going to be going through an energy transition over the next several decades, and there's great opportunities in clean energy. And frankly, the industries or the people that really have the most know-how to do clean energy are the ones that are currently engaged in the energy industry. And you have to have the science background and technology and understanding of the technology to do that. Whether it's building facilities for hydrogen or even going into alternative energy sources, such as solar, wind, and et cetera. There's still, a certain amount of adaptability that's needed in order to get into it. And people who are in the energy sector really can take advantage of their skills. On the other hand, ESG and all the multiple things that are associated with ESG, such as governance rules, diversity on boards, and social rules, which are things like human rights and where you risks that you're associated with investing in countries with poor human rights, and of course now national security, which is an extremely important issue because we've now realized is that oil and gas and coal is still needed in this world today, and if we handicap ourselves with very high energy prices without having alternatives available, then it's going to be very difficult for the world economy. And so I think we have to acknowledge that ESG and all the disclosure requirements and et cetera that's associated with it is going to have very significant costs on Canadian businesses, including energy costs, which are going to go up quite rapidly this decade as a result of moving too quickly on the climate change file without recognizing that it takes time to adapt to new technologies.
Yeah, 100%. And affordable energy is so very important to manufacturing. What other impacts of these ESG policies do you see on our manufacturing sector in Canada?
Well, I think one of the things that's coming up now, I think, is the security issue, and as I've written about, is if we're really serious about security as being part of the ESG framework, and we were going to treat it like climate change, and we can think about the risks that a business has in terms of its, let's say, facilities that it might have in risky countries, politically risky countries, and that might be something that they should report to their investors. But then, similar to Scope 2 and Scope 3, GHG emissions, you can talk about Scope 2 and Scope 3 security issues. In other words, you might be dealing with a supplier that has all its factories that are operating in Russia, for example. That could be a very significant risk if you end up losing that supplier, and whether you can get an alternative that can make up if you had some significant losses associated with that. And so you can actually think of all the parallel things with security as you would with climate change, which I think gets to the heart of ESG, is is how do you really weight all these different things? Just as you mentioned, people like to have uh, cheap and reliable energy. We don't want to have blackouts all the time or brownouts. If there's a serious problem. Um, but at the same time, we may worry about the environment. We want to make sure that we have um, those kind of measures that try to reduce environmental impact, not just climate change, but also other environmental impacts. Then how do you make those trade-offs? And ESG mechanisms really don't know how to weight these things. They just simply measure all these different factors and add them all up and divide by n the number of factors, and says, here's your ranking.
And we're back. Joining me today is Dr. Jack Mintz, and we're talking about the ESG movement and its impact on the Canadian economy. So, Dr. Mintz, who's behind the ESG movement? Who's pushing this among the large corporations?
Well, I think we have to remember it really started with governments, and they were influenced by the environmental movements that were pushing climate change, and that really was, I think, the strength behind the development of ESG. People did realize then that there's other things that affect, let's say, sustainability of companies, and so therefore they added on these other factors that became the S and the G. But I think environmental has been the number one issue that I think people are worried about. And I think those are the people that have really pushed it, and they pushed it through various government bodies and also international bodies. And the World Economic Forum that everyone talks about, I think, I'm not sure, maybe they're taking too much credit for all the influence. There's been a very well-known interview between Klaus Schwab, who runs the World Economic Forum, and David Gherkin, and he was going on about how he influenced Trudeau and half the cabinet and the Canadian government. And so one can easily get to conspiracy theories about the World Economic Forum. But it is, I think there has been a lot of movement, I think, by financial lenders, particularly, to get onto the bandwagon. And of course, the reason for that is that they see a lot of money that's going to come from investments in clean energy. They're not too worried about the impact of households in terms of energy costs and reliability of that energy. What they want to do is make money. And so if they see new investments that are going to take place in clean energy, then they're going to be really wanting to push this. And of course, pushing ESG and trying to push people into and companies into investments in the ESG related type activities, which is really like the clean energy movement that we're now seeing, then they're going to benefit a great deal from that.
So they're really taking taxpayers' money to fund some of these new investments and new business models. Is that correct?
Oh, some of it is taking taxpayers' money, but some of it is just taking investor money too. People have been putting money into ESG funds. I think there's about $300 billion now worldwide in the ESG funds. And there's also money that banks have raised that they invest and, of course, lend to various companies. And it's going to be very expensive. Going through the energy transition, the estimates are for trillions of dollars. In fact, McKinsey has come up with $275 trillion over the next 30 years, which is roughly 4.5% of GDP over the next each year over the next 30 years, and that is hugely expensive, and somebody has to pay for it, and frankly, the taxpayers can't pay it all, and so it's going to have to come out of the private sector. But it also means that other things won't get invested in because there's only so much money that can go around.
Absolutely, and but when you look at the cost and the cost on pushing down on small to medium-sized business, how has the ESG movement been able to get so many major corporations and financial institutions to just sign on to their charter?
Well, I think so. I mean, there'll be disclosure requirements, and there'll be probably exemptions given for many small businesses because they won't be able to afford trying to track, how many, how much GHG emissions are in, that other suppliers have and things like that. In fact, they may have trouble even doing their own. So there'll probably be a lot of exemptions in that regard. But I think the one thing that they can expect are going to be higher costs. And because there is an expense that's going to be associated not just with compliance, but also pushing up energy costs. Because in order to create profitability for alternative energy sources, whether it's hydrogen or carbon capture and storage, or hydroelectricity, or charging stations for electric vehicles, whatever that cost is, somebody has to pay for it, and that's going to come out of higher energy prices, particularly, and whatever tax dollars that people are going to have to put up in order to pay for the subsidies that governments are going to be paying out.
Absolutely. We're seeing ESG not only at financial community and large institutions, but they're pushing it down on their supply chains, and many small business and medium-sized business aren't going to be able to compete. And they also are competing against products that are coming offshore that don't have the same requirements. So we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be back with Dr. Jack Mintz. We're talking about the ESG movement and its impact on the Canadian economy. You're watching Canadian Innovators. Welcome back. I'm Jocelyn Bamford. My guest today is economist Jack Mintz, and we're talking about the ESG movement and its impact on Canadian competitiveness. Jack, this is the part of the show that every week I ask my guest if they were a politician, what 3 things they would do to grow jobs and the economy. You're on the hot seat. What would you do?
Well, I think the first thing is that we need to get private investment going. So I would have major tax reform in order to increase, I think, both the ability of households to save money for their future, because they need to do that, but also for businesses to make capital available, including for the changes that are going to happen rapidly through the economy. We have to remember we have a retiring workforce that is going to be in full force over the next number of years. We're also going to be having digitization and new innovations like artificial intelligence that's going to affect how businesses perform. And then, of course, there's the energy transition that's very expensive, and all that's going to need investment. And right now, we don't have policies that are going to help that. The second I would also have is deregulation, because regulation, I think, does have a huge impact in terms of costs and delaying investments. And we do need large investments to take place. Canada is well known for having one of the slowest permitting systems in the world. In terms of actually getting projects done. And there's, of course, tons of stories about how we are having trouble getting things built in this country, and yet we're going to need to do that. So we're going to have a much different approach to regulation than what we've been doing so far. And I think the third thing I would do is for governments to move to much more efficient and effective policies. For example, there are some efficient policies for climate change that if you do price it, then companies will figure out how to get around, how to deal with the price. And it actually does create value for some of the things that need to be done, whether it's building hydrogen plants or other things. We don't need a lot of other meddlesome type of policies, such as the clean fuel standard, which is going to increase costs, raise energy prices, and there's absolutely nothing that's going to help businesses deal with the cost of that. And it's totally redundant. We already have a carbon tax, and why are we adding on the clean fuel standard? So there's a lot of things that need to be done, I think, in order to have much more rational government that is going to try to keep costs down, while at the same time accommodate the changes that are going to be needed in Canada in the coming years.
I agree with all that you've said. Jack Mintz for Prime Minister. You wrote an article in the Financial Post during Junk Science Week entitled "The Backlash Against ESG is Only Just Starting." Could you talk about this article? It was a great article.
Thank you. Well, it was basically based on some things that I was reading, and actually I started with a Google search and just typed in backlash and GHD or ESG, sorry, and wow, there were just tons and tons of articles that have been now written, going through actually people getting very upset with ESG because it is such a nebulous concept. I mean, how do you identify a good ESG company? I might be able to identify a company that, let's say, has good profitability or even has low greenhouse gas emissions. I can measure those things, but you can't measure ESG and what's good and bad about an ESG company. There's no proper way of doing it. It's really a hokey concept, and so I think that's the reason why it's become so disregarded by so many investors around the world, whether it's Warren Buffett or whoever, because they are now starting to realize it doesn't make sense. And we've seen that recently with the Russian Ukrainian war that has shown that how badly Germany has done with their ESG practices and trying to move to clean energy, closing down nuclear plants, et cetera. And now they're faced with a major energy crisis, which is probably going to be huge next year. And that might be our future topic.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks to my guest, Jack Mintz. I'm Jocelyn Bamford. Thank you for watching Canadian Innovators. If you're an innovator, tell us your story. Write to us at CanadianInnovators@thenewsforum.ca, and we'll see you next time.